Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Common Sense with Dr. Ben Carson. I'm your host, Ben Carson, and today I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Wilfred Reilly. He's a political scientist, an associate professor at Kentucky State University, which happens to be the oldest HBCU in the state of Kentucky. He's an author. He's an academic that focuses on American race relations and criminal justice. And he's the author of the book, Hate Crime Hoax, How the Left is Selling a Fake Race War. And I'm excited to talk to him today about his latest book, Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, Debunking the False Narratives Defining America's School Curricula. So welcome to the podcast, Will. We're so delighted that you're here and all the work that you've been doing on behalf of our society.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on, Doc.
Absolutely. I appreciate the way that you approach things, not taking the traditional view of much of anything, which is good, makes people think. And your willingness not only to refute some of the progressive ideologies, but using data, but also some very colorful language sometimes, which is quite good too. But, one of the big lies that we hear all the time is that America is uniquely evil because of slavery, and that our slavery was uniquely brutal. Is that true?
No, Dr. Carson, that's not true. And you pointed out the book is called Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me. And it's a response to a really famous book called Lies My Teacher Told Me. So we authors don't always have the most original lead-ins to good material. But the original book basically said that America's core message is taught from the right. It's taught by the church. It's taught by the conservative schools of the 1950s, right? Columbus was an unbesmirched hero, this kind of thing. And the book actually makes some good points. This is a book that began to be drawn together as a series of articles in the early 1990s, and it was talking about an even earlier period. But it struck me years ago in graduate school, looking at Howard Zinn, all that sort of thing, that this was 30 years ago, and they're talking about a time 20, 30 years before that, I think it's fair to say. What's going on now? And what's going on now, if you actually look at the data-based breakdowns of entire fields like higher education, the national news media, is that the people that produce information lean about 93% to the right. That's a Pew in 2004. And I know we've both seen this. Only 7% of national media journalists are libertarians, conservatives, far right, anything like that. By definition, the other 93% are Marxists, Democrats, or left-leaning, generally moderates. So the whole theme of the book is, okay, now we actually know where today's information is coming from. Is that any more accurate? The answer is no. To directly answer your question, in contrast with some things we're currently seeing on the political stage, no, American slavery was not uniquely evil or uniquely abusive. When people think about slavery, we in America tend to think almost entirely of the exploitation of blacks, our ethnic group, West African blacks, in either the USA or at most the New World. And that's an incredibly narrow lens, as Thomas Sowell, among others, has pointed out. Like, slavery is one of the oldest human vices. If you win a war or some similar conflict with another group of people, there are really only two or three options. You can execute everyone that you take post haste. You can eat them, which is what the Aztecs did. Humans used to be savages. You can let them go to come back and fight you again, or you can bring them to your country and have them unwillingly improve their agricultural skills for some period of time. And many, many foreign leaders, white and black, over the millennia, Arab, Asian, decided to do the fourth, the last. So, you can go back into ancient Sumerian and Egyptian cuneiform and find the word for slave. It's one of the 20 earliest human words. Obviously, Greece and Rome, we already know the people fighting tigers shirtless in arenas were not there voluntarily. You go forward into what we think of as the medieval period, when there were very many civilized Arab kingdoms, West African kingdoms, Caucasian kingdoms. All these people enslaved each other. There's the idea of galley slavery. If you were captured, you'd be made to row a boat until you died. Barbary slavery, 2 million whites taken by the Arabs. I guess getting to the point, no, there's nothing especially unique. Maybe you could argue the level of racialization, but even there, the Arabs categorized slaves racially as Slavs, Abids, so on. They believed
Absolutely.
certain types of slaves were better suited for certain work. So no, American slavery not unique.
And of course, if you go to the Bible, you'll see that the Israelites were slaves. They became slaves in Egypt for 400 years.
Yes,
But
and that's like many things in the Bible. That's also documented in academic histories. I mean, the periods of defeat of the Jewish people, like by the Romans after Masada, all of these highly civilized peoples could write. So there are extensive records of this. I mean, the Romans, of course, had many non-Jewish slaves.
right,
I mean, I've read Caesar's The Gallic Wars as a schoolboy. All Gaul was divided into three parts. As I recall, he conquered all three. You know, the fighting men were taken as servants, the
right.
women perhaps as a different kind of servant. You know, the entire nation was reduced. Caesar at one point famously said, "I'll make your people into a memory." So there's a lengthy history of this kind of thing. And very briefly, I actually have a friend who's a black Egyptian. And he was once debating with a friend of mine who is a Jewish guy over coffee. We are all sitting around trying to be sophisticated, cups on the little saucers. And the Egyptian guy, the black African guy, asks the Jewish guy, "Can you think of a single time historically when people like mine enslaved a white group?" And the Jewish guy just started laughing hysterically because that's the most famous example of slavery there probably is. And he enlightened the other guy and said, "Well, yes, when the Egyptians and then the Babylon, I mean, when my people were held in bondage, you know." So if you actually go through these great texts, you read your Bible, you read your Torah, yes, there are many examples there as well.
Well, it's interesting because I frequently say the United States was unique in its slavery in the sense that it's the only country that had so many people who were vehemently opposed to it that we fought a bloody civil war and lost a large portion of our population to stop the evil institution. And maybe that's what we should be teaching our kids, that even in the midst of something as evil as that, there are good people. And in the long run, it was the good people who won out. But it was a bloody confrontation to get there. But why do you think why is it so important for the left, particularly, uh, to demonize this country over slavery?
Well, I think it's instrumental. I mean, that's a very good question. But so if you're actually looking at the history of slavery, I mean, one question that any kind of edgy white or black American guy would ask online is, well, if we're talking about reparation, why wouldn't reparations be sought from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, the countries where the great Arab slave, not great in the historical sense of conquerors, but the Arab slavers came from? These are some of the wealthiest countries in the world. The rising black powers, Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa. I mean, these are G40 sort of countries, large economies. Why not there? I mean, places like Benin, that's literally the slave coast. These are still nations today. So, I mean, as the Nigerian GDP rises to 29th in the world, as the Arabs outpace us man to man, why is the focus on, for that matter, Spain, Portugal, when you talk about who conquered the New World, these weren't white Northern Europeans. I mean, they were half of what we now consider the Hispanic population. They were Levantine, dark skinned. I personally prefer not to think of people in this fashion, but they were Levantine, dark skinned fighters. Humans throughout history have all been quite brutal to each other. So if you're talking about reparations, why is the focus entirely on American whites above the upper middle class? Well, the answer is because those are the people that they think will pay. So I think this entire, I mean, you're not going to go to Spain or to Nigeria and present this in parliament. They'd laugh you out. So I think that there is a focus on this narrative, not just for academic reasons. A true leftist will tell you the academic and the personal are political. There's a focus on this narrative for instrumental reasons. Like if we can convince Americans that the two founding pillars of the country are slavery and genocide, in reality, there are more natives alive today than there were when Columbus arrived, and slavery was responsible for 6.8% of America's GDP, I believe, thinking of Phil Magnus's writing. But if you can convince people of that, then there are a lot of changes we have to make today. Reparations need to be paid. What we call DEI programs, those might need to be set in place permanently, so on. So left-wing political goals are advanced by this storyline. The storyline, we were all brutal to each other, and then a racially diverse Union army shot enough people that the brutality stopped. That's something your dad might bluntly say, but there's no one gets paid as a result of that. That's not instrumental for anything but patriotism.
Absolutely. Victimhood seems to be the goal of a lot of this stuff. But, what I always say is, it really doesn't matter where your ancestors came from. They could come from Great Britain, Ireland, Africa, Japan. You're probably better off here than you would be back there. And, we should celebrate the fact that we have a country that has provided so many opportunities for so many different people. But people choose to inflict victimhood. And I always say, if you think you're a victim, you are. When did the slave trade actually stop in our country?
Yeah, so one of the points that you're making here is that there was this lengthy process of cessation of slavery that in the end took a lot of lives, and that's correct. So there are different ways to tell a story. The way I would tell the story of slavery is that this was a universal human vice. You had to do something with these damned beaten enemies. And this went on over all of time until in the modern West, largely as a result of Christianity, we began to oppose the practice and shut it down. And I'll also add, since I'm something of a materialist, I respect the great religions, but I also look at economics here on Earth. We also started developing machinery in the modern era. Right. So had we not had, there would be no feminism if it weren't for light portable handguns, birth control, and washing machines. Similarly, would slavery ever have ended if it hadn't been for the McCormick Reaper, the cotton gin, the tractor? Perhaps not. But as the Christian religion in its relatively modern form began to be taken more and more seriously throughout the West, the High Middle Ages onward, and as technological development, even the horse collar, rendered, peons in the fields less necessary, you started seeing the West, and only the West, move against this ancient practice. And the slave trade, if I recall, was banned in the United States in 1808. So there were already slaves here, and that was considered a great quandary. Washington, Jefferson, you probably know this better than I do, but had to deal with the fact that they had inherited these enslaved people and also other unfree people. So, if you owned a large plantation, your father's will might say something like, I leave to my son Thomas 20 Negroes, 12 Irishmen under contracts of indenture, and 3 cows. It was quite specific. It was quite blunt. There also might be a free Indian village on your land or something like that. So the idea that most people would be free citizens in the yeoman class as we are today, that's not something that existed at this time. So in 1808, we ended the slave trade. Slavery itself obviously persisted until 1865, but you see that slow process of redemption almost, of ending the practice.
That's something that I think most people don't realize. They tag the time to the Emancipation Proclamation, but the whole legal system was ended far before that time. But in terms of slavery, is it still existing in the world today?
Yes, actually, one of my causes, and if you just Google oppose modern day slavery, there are 10, 12 groups that are roughly on par in terms of who you might want to give to. You should look through them. But one of my causes actually is ending modern day slavery, which still goes on at an extremely frequent, rapid, I guess would be the term, pace in, for example, the Islamic world. In Mauritania, there's an entire class of people that are held as slaves by both black Moorish fighters and essentially white Arabs, the Bedouin. So that was the state of affairs for most of history, and it hasn't yet ended. In fact, if you talk to Human Rights Watch or some of the people that I spoke to quite briefly for my book, but I did check out the websites, message people, there are probably more slaves today in the world than there have been at any previous point in history.
Right.
In Libya, there was an open-air slave market at one point in the past 5-6 years.
When you look at human trafficking, which is really slavery, it is absolutely blossoming all over the world. But what some people don't realize is that it can't exist if you don't have customers. And that's a big problem in our country. And a lot of these self-righteous people who talk about slavery 200 years ago don't recognize that they're participating today, and really are just as evil as the people who perpetrated that institution many, many years ago. What was the goal, or is the goal, of the 1619 Project?
Well, I think there are two goals. It's a great question. I think there are two goals. One is what they say their goal is, which is linking almost every characteristic of modern American society to historical black slavery. So, 1619 founder and doyen Nicole Hannah-Jones has very famously said that America is a slavocracy, racism's in our DNA. Everything that's unique about the United States comes out of the enslavement of black Africans, which
Yeah.
strikes me as facially nonsensical. I mean, I once made a list for almost humor points on Twitter that included Indian food, Irish taverns, the professional tennis circuit. But that's the claim, that every slavery has touched and influenced virtually every facet of American life. So if you read the 1619 Project essays in the New York Times Magazine, one of them, for example, argues that traffic congestion in American cities is in large part a product of the way they were designed during the era of slavery and segregation. Again, I think that's nonsensical. Geographers have looked at this and they found that the greatest rates of traffic congestion are out on the West Coast, where new build, poorly designed cities exist. There's almost no correlation between past racial conflict and how people drive. Recent immigrants tend to be worse drivers, but we don't need to get into the literature. That's one of the claims. Another claim is that Americans eat so much sugar because that's what the slaves used to grow, simplifying an article. But the stated purpose is to connect everything that we see in the country to the presence of blacks in the country. And that, if it were done honorably, I think could actually be a worthy goal. I don't necessarily think you could accomplish it. But the second goal of the 1619 Project is creating an alternative history for the United States. Mm-hmm. And the founders have been quite open about this in in-depth interviews, where they'll say that the American storyline that we have begins, I'd say, with the Pilgrims. And it goes through the Revolutionary War. We beat the mighty British Redcoats. Mm-hmm. And it proceeds from there in kind of a steady upline that includes blacks here and there, but not as primary figures. The settling of the West, so on down the line, negotiation with the great Indian tribes, the Industrial Revolution. What Hannah-Jones wants to do is put slavery in as the keystone piece that made all that possible. Like the American era of overseas trade was made possible by cotton, this sort of thing. And then say black people are owed X amount because of this historical role. So there are two purposes. One is just illustrating the black role historically in an exaggerated fashion, but the other is saying, because of this role, you owe us.
Exactly. Well, that brings us to the whole idea of morality. And you state that modern American morality is an aberration. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think there's a fascinating conversation that I'd love to have with you over beer or coffee sometime about what number of rules are ultimate in any sense. I mean, is morality ultimate is the greatest question in human philosophy. The theologians say yes. The contemporary philosophers say no. Many people sort of come down in the middle and say that you have things that are malum in se as a human that we know are naturally bad, child rape. I would tend to agree with this. And then there are many other things that are malum judicicum, would be the way the Romans would put it. They're illegal just because we say they are.
Right.
You can't drive 75, but you can drive 70 in Kentucky. So there's this whole debate about ethics, and it's interesting. I'd love to talk to you about it. But what we can definitely say is that the formalized ethical systems in different societies over the millennia have been very different. So the standard view in what I would describe as good societies of morality has been that morality consists of doing those things that make you a virtuous and contributing citizen. This is the Viking nine noble virtues. This is Bushido. This is the Iroquois way. This is muscular Christianity, so on. And I don't remember all the 9 noble virtues. I follow a more modern path. But I mean, one is bravery, hard work, magnanimity, give to the poor. They're all pretty consistent. The modern ethical system outside of traditional Christians and some Stoics, maybe some Orthodox Jews, seems to have become what I would call empathy-based morality.
Mhm.
where the idea is that the only thing that matters in terms of how you're judged morally is not hurting other people, including some people that would deserve to be hurt, perhaps. In fact, certainly sometimes. Illegal immigrants, you can't send them home. Rapists, you can't castrate and then execute them, this sort of thing.
Right.
Um, and I think that when people who've been trained in modern empathic morality, which, as you can probably tell, I believe, already goes too far, look back at the past, they tend to come to the conclusion that everyone was evil. And I'm kind of rambling on about this, but I don't think that's a logical conclusion. I think that most people, certainly people in pre-Christian, pre-Islamic societies, were following other moral codes that were different from our own. And it's important to recognize that. So we can say that moving past the right of conquest, I mean, traditionally, if you fought a reasonably honest war with someone else and you won, you took their land. They could revolt, they could try for it back at some point, but it was yours. It was the blood price for all the men you'd lost.
Right.
I.e., the incomers didn't steal the United States, they conquered it from these warrior peoples like the Sioux and the Comanche and so on. And I 100% agree with this. But I guess in one sentence, there's a conflict between the way that modern soft people have been trained to look at the world and the way everyone else looked at the world for all of time. And that makes it very easy to judge all of history as composed of evil people. The Crusaders were evil. They didn't follow the Geneva Conventions. And when it came to dealing with prisoners, Martin Luther King was evil, cheated on his wife. He was not entirely honorable in business. Everyone was bad until just now in my dorm room. And a final point that just came to me here, even that could be tolerable. It's just people following their society's contemporary morality.
Hmm.
If this rule were applied fairly, but it's not, very often moral critiques are only made of the West or of white people or of successful people, which would include me and you, black conservatives, whatever. But no one ever takes the rule that colonialism is bad on the modern American left and applies that logically. Where again, powerful countries like China, Mongolia, Arabia, so on, Turkey, would be some of the worst historical offenders. So there's an issue of presentism, people taking today's rules, trying to apply them to the past, and doing so in a biased fashion. I think that's a good short summary.
And it doesn't matter whether you really are victimized as long as you feel like you've been victimized. Is that a fair characterization of what they think?
Yeah, I mean, so one point that you made earlier, and I think we both just moved on, but it's worth getting back to, is the idea of what the harm is.
Yeah.
So the whole claim of reparations is that black people were harmed by slavery. And that's actually fairly difficult to argue. Like, slaves were harmed by slavery.
Right.
If you were a banner captain in the Benin army and you lost and you were loaded into the stinking hull of a boat, you were taken to a new country and you were told, your name is Toby, grab a hoe. That is a demotion in social status that I'm sure better medicine and so on, but that was very, very unpleasant.
Right.
However, no black person alive today has been a slave. Very few black people alive today experienced anything like real Jim Crow. I mean, the South began to desegregate in 1954.
Right.
I'm 40 years old. I was born in 1981. So, 40 plus. So the question for black Americans today, bluntly, is, are we worse off than we would be had our ancestors remained in Africa as captives, remember,
Right.
rather than coming here? Would we be better off, and now, it would probably be the Nigerian working class, than in the roles that we currently occupy in society? And I think it's very difficult to argue that.
Well,
So,
you have to be very honest to go back and ask that question. Because, I did an ancestor analysis and found out that 77% of me is sub-Saharan Africa, from Tanzania and Kenya through the Turkana tribe, which is a wandering tribe. They're still a wandering tribe today. But I suspect had I been born in that tribe, I would never have become an international brain surgeon.
yes, I'm glad you were not born into a tribe of Kenyan nomads. I think that this is one of those things that you're not supposed to say. Like,
Correct.
men and women are very different, or there are large cultural and there may be small genetic contributions to IQ and athletic performance, this sort of thing. The issue with reparations, we've both laid it out very bluntly. you would have to demonstrate a harm to black people today of the old wars, i.e., would we be better off if we were in Africa? And I tend to suspect that most of the African tribes, outside of a few of the mighty ones, the Igbo and so on, but the Yoruba, but most of them would be in that sort of situation. I mean,
And
a lot of
so would people of other races.
oh yeah,
It doesn't matter where they came from.
well
This is the land of opportunity.
that's an excellent point, because I think these conversations often devolve into people sort of denigrating each other. You get, I mean, the Chicago stereotype would be the black guy, the Irishman, the Mexican guy, and the Jew arguing about Jewish American arguing about who had it worse historically. It almost doesn't matter. I mean, so no one's going back to Northern Ireland either from the United States. No one's going to go back to Sicily. No one's going to go back to Bosnia. No one's going back to Mexico. I mean, except on a visit. So yes, living in the richest country in the world is in general a good thing, because by definition, it's better than all the other things.
Exactly.
So we can certainly say it's unfortunate we had no Irish need apply as a nearly official policy in the country. That doesn't mean you're owed money for it. There's a reason you're not living in a slum in Dublin and that you don't want to. So, I mean, I think it's important to keep both those things in mind. And last comment, this gets back to your point about morality. I think that our morality today, we could push aside some of the empathy, some of the other stuff. I think I'll try to clarify that point and make it at a later time.
Okay.
Ready for the next question. These are deep issues, the philosophical stuff.
Well, your politically incorrect view that colonialization has benefited some of the colonialized. What do you have to say about that?
Well, I think a lot of these questions, we're doing a lot of kind of crossing of the border between the logical and the moral. And I think that's interesting, because it's perfectly fine to say, well, by today's standards, we think it's immoral to conquer countries. Now, of course, major power players like Vladimir Putin and George W. Bush have at different times said, I think there's an external threat, justly or not, and launched wars of conquest. So whether or not there's any validity to that even today is, again, a fascinating question to debate. But it's fine to say that today we reject the right of conquest. However, the fact is that throughout all of history, everyone accepted it. Everyone behaved in what they thought of as a very moral fashion, often for Christian or Islamic reasons, following that rule. And it's silly to condemn all of these people as evil. So I'm going to set the moral conversation aside right now. I don't necessarily think the ancients were wrong about this one, by the way. I don't think Afghanistan is better off under Taliban rule, even in ethical terms, the treatment of women. But I don't think that the moral case is entirely weak. But in logical terms, if we're talking in logical, empirical terms about what governments have given to the people, it obviously is the case that colonialism was often a positive for colonized regions. There are areas like South India that can say, we were developed enough that we almost won the war against the whites. We think there was a net negative if you add in certain famines and so on. And that's an academic debate that's going on. But when you look at, for example, Kenya, when you look at a lot of these regions that were in the British Empire, the Black Paradise Islands now just off the U.S. coast, Jamaica, Barbados, Bahamas, all that, I think it's empirically obvious that the standard of living, where you're talking about scattered native tribes or introduced African slaves or something like that, prior to the invasion and development of the country, was drastically inferior to the standard of living at the end of that period. Chiuna Achebe in Nigeria, to give a very solid example that I've mentioned a couple times, criticizes colonialism. He describes racism. He describes atrocities on both sides during fighting. That's fair. But he also says, let's be real, the British built the entire network of schools in the country. I mean, the British built the University of West Africa. They built the railroads. So if you're talking about whether the old indigenous chiefs, most of whom were not fools, many of whom governed fairly well, whether they did more for the people in Area X, or whether the Westerners, often for amoral reasons like trying to set up a transport network, did more for Area X, the answer is often the Westerners. Bruce Gilley of Portland State wrote an entire extensively footnoted book documenting this, where he talks about railroads, he talks about universities, schools. Remember, you are a real doctor. Medicine at this point varied dramatically around the world. So if you're going to an area where you basically have witch doctors and you're introducing post-Pasteur Western medicine, you're saving millions of lives. So yeah, that's all in the plus column for colonialism. The argument against colonialism outside of maybe India is totally moral. It's just you should not conquer countries. Well, okay, but no one thought that then.
Well, you know, the argument is made that we did horrible things to the Native Americans. Uh, and that's the big argument against colonialism. What do you think?
Well, I think that there are a couple. So as you probably know, I'm a debater from time to time. I'll actually take a stage and go against someone else. I've debated Jared Taylor, the founder of the alt-right. He would never agree to an in-person date, but I've bantered with Ibram Kendi online. So that's kind of the whole spectrum, Kendi to Taylor. Right. And when you're debating, you would always say before the start of a match, "Sir, define your terms." And I think that that's how I'd respond to that. I mean, so first, when you say, well, we did horrible things to the native North American Indians or South American Indians, the first comment I would make is we. I mean, if you're talking about British whites or African descent blacks, I mean, we started coming in the 1630s in any numbers. The people who conquered the Incas and the Aztecs and were incensed enough by native atrocities that they did butcher a lot of people. Those were, again, dark-skinned Spanish-speaking Spaniards. So I think it's unfortunate the Spaniards and the Aztecs butchered each other, but that doesn't go on the American tally column on either side. You also have to look at what bad things means. So the Aztecs, the Jaguar Knights and so on, were some of the best fighting men in world history. So when you ask, why did the Spaniards beat them so easily? Two things come to mind. One, the Spaniards carried with them old world diseases.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you read through Plagues and Peoples or one of these kind of books, I mean, probably 90% of native casualties in the New World, certainly in Mesoamerica, came from smallpox and the like. The Spanish beat the Aztecs in, I think, 3 of the 4 battles. They lost on La Noche Triste. But both of these peoples were hardened men of war. That wouldn't have stopped the conflict. What stopped the conflict is that if your general goes to negotiate with their general, he comes back and then he dies. So, I mean, that must have been horrifying. You truly feel, their gods are stronger than ours. So, which is not necessarily, again, an entirely unempirical conclusion to come to. But that was so who did the bad things? What do we mean by the bad things? Those are the major points. I would also say colonialism has to have a meaning. So when I or Gilly as political scientists would define colonialism, it's not really external adventuring of the kind that the Spaniards were doing and that the Aztecs also did against the Maya. It's external governance. So you'd have to pick a time frame, like from the start of the British colonies in the New World, 1650 or whatever, right, to the end of the British Empire. You look at Britain, France, Germany, and you pick 2 other countries. This is, as you know, how you'd sketch on a paper. Was that good or was that bad? And I think there's a pretty strong argument that it was good. Again, in logical terms. The counter argument is wholly moral. It's people died, this sort of thing. So I'm not sure I'd count the Spaniards as colonizers in the modern sense. It's interesting to debate.
I think a lot of people are not cognizant of what you said, and that is the diseases that were brought in. That was what really slaughtered the native population of this country. And, there were a lot of alliances that were made between the Native Americans and those who were coming from overseas. When you look at some of the wars, the French and Indian War, all of these things, they made alliances like any other people do for their own good. But it was the diseases that really devastated the populations. So.
Yeah, well, there are 2 things there. I mean, so first, yes, the idea that modern racial ideas kind of come from us fighting each other during the period that I call the Old Wars. So when you say blacks in the New World, what you mean are the descendants of hundreds of powerful tribes that were brought together in this one place, the USA or Brazil, and who ended up as a group competing with whites and natives. Right. So similarly, like the idea of Native Americans is a relatively modern idea. If you ask someone in the 1650s, the decade we've been using, what's your background? They would say, I'm a Mohawk. I'm a member of the Iroquois coalition that actually for 100 years is going to keep you whites out of the Great Lakes area. So, yes, when the Spaniards arrived in what we now call Mexico, the land of the Mexica, people hated the Aztecs, the Triple Alliance. I mean, the Aztecs were cannibals. They were vicious, aggressive warriors. And so you're talking about something like a nightmare out of the Hunger Games, where every year you would give thousands of young people in tribute to the Aztecs, and they would take them to a pyramid in the center of their capital city, Tenochtitlan, which is as big as Rome. They would
Right.
cut their hearts out and they would eat them. And this was all this graphic spectacle, like the kings and queens of surrounding peoples were forced to come in and watch. So when the Spanish arrived, the people that were close enough to power in the Aztecs, they could beat them with a few hundred good allies, the horsemen of the Spaniard, the Cholulans, immediately allied with the Spaniards. So it was the army of Cholula, which was 40,000 people strong. Many of those people became nobles in the New World, by the way, that helped the Spanish army take Tenochtitlan, which is one of the great historical battle scenes, by the way.
Yeah.
I mean, the Aztecs had fairly weak weapons in our terms, spears and so on. But imagine like the great pyramids full of people
Right.
painted with war paint and wearing the skins of jaguars and dressed up in costumes like great birds, charging you with their weapons were basically baseball bats studded with razor blades, incredibly well-made axes. The Spanish were in their Mauryan helmets, their breastplates, fighting with swords and rapiers. So, I mean, this went on for days, but the thing that pushed the Spaniards over the top was their native allies. And yeah, the thing that really gave them the edge was disease. In the most brutal sense, that's also probably why they were able to dominate the Chileans later. None of these peoples were immune to these Spanish viruses that came from close cohabitation with pigs and cows and these animals they didn't have in the New World. A final point there, though. Tobacco comes from the New World. Cocaine comes from the New World. The Aztecs and the Incas were aware of both of these substances. Syphilis and many other varieties of genital rot come from the New World, where there was a long tradition of offering young women as hospitality. So when you say, well, we brought this great poison that killed 100 million people, what we took from the civilized natives were these other three great poisons that have probably killed 1 billion people. So it's really, and it's funny, but it's also, there's a darkness there. Like cocaine didn't exist in the old world. So when you add up these historical tally cards, it's really difficult to do. Like if the natives intentionally introduced tobacco to the Westerners because they thought they'd like it as a trade good and they knew it was addictive, is there some burden there on their side, some duty to apologize?
Right.
And if not, why not? I mean, why would a Spanish knight who was barely literate be expected to understand disease theory? So there's a whole thing going on.
I guess that's why Thomas Sowell says it's no right or wrong or winner or loser. It's a give and take from both sides. The BLM phenomenon. How is it that you think they've been so successful until they were found out?
I like it that you added that last line. I think for Spiked magazine, I wasn't one of the first, but I was one of the people who did a pretty good deep dive on where the money went with Black Lives Matter. Most people don't know this to this day, but the different BLM chapters, the top 60 or so, were awarded $11 billion by different charitable foundations. That figures from The Economist, September of 2020. You can look it up today. For whatever reason, they never pulled the article. I think they were just confident in their findings. Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation alone, BLM-GNF, which is the group I researched, took in 90 to 100 million. And they basically just blew it. Like I was able to obtain their records, and none of the money went to what you or I might call the hood, to
Sure.
black churches in the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, groups that, might have had some fun with it, but also would have done a lot of good. It's not where it went. It mostly went to gay and trans rights organizations. I'd have to look them up, but there were sex worker rights groups. There was For the Girls, which is an organization that lets, I think it's trans prostitutes travel to get a break from their lives. Just all this stuff. And you have to remember that Patrice Cullors and these people were not entrenched in the black community to the extent that you or I would be. We don't need to talk about Al Sharpton. They were lesbian Marxist activists.
All right.
The first isn't something I worry too much about, but definitely not tied into the core, the Greek, the church, what you think of as black society.
Certainly not traditional family values.
Not only did they not have traditional family values, one of the original 6 core points of Black Lives Matter was destroying the black male-led nuclear family.
Right.
Which comes pretty close to being a definition of evil to me. Evil is entropy reflected through human beings. So you have here someone that's supporting lesbian sex work that is devoting a good chunk of their money to ending strong black men's role in black households. I mean, that's not a good thing in the end. That this is all completely different from the police violence stuff, which was just the cover presented to the public facing eye. But why did this work so well? I actually think there's a pretty deep answer there. So in the United States, we have these large gaps in performance between different racial and ethnic groups. And this doesn't break down exactly the way a lot of people think it does. If you actually look at SAT data year over year, Native Americans underperform African Americans. Natives last year got a 912 on the test. Blacks got about a 950. These are both bad scores, but
Sure.
neither is utterly embarrassing, and ours was a bit ahead. Appalachian whites, I believe the average SAT in West Virginia was either 840 or 940. They're right around there as well. So there's a complex class picture, racial picture. But the plain reality is if you line up all the black guys next to all the white guys, I mean, we make $10,000 to $12,000 less per year in personal income. Our crime rate is 2.4 times the white average. Just on and on and on. Out of wedlock birth rate for black females who have a child with black men, 71%. You know all this as well as I do. Now, I will note whites have just hit 40%, at least looking at my state. So it's not a race, you know.
Right.
But nonetheless, we're doing quite badly. And so the question is, why is that? And in the United States, it's become, for whatever reason, almost taboo to discuss most of the possible reason. I'm a culturalist. I can't help but notice that most of this stuff is downstream from the black fatherlessness rate going from 11%, Walter Williams, 2012, up to 70%. So, I mean, I think you're going to see similar things, suicide, hard drug use, so on in white communities as that number skyrockets. And I think you're already seeing some of that. But that's one perspective. Another perspective would be that some aspect of this is genetic. I don't agree with this, but that's Arthur Jensen, Charles Murray, Dick Bernstein. It's not crazy fanaticism. And I mean, these same people would point out, well, Asians are outperforming whites. When you select black groups like Nigerians, they outperform whites too. So even as a culturalist, how do you explain that? So there's this whole debate, 3 to 4 different paradigms. But to the extent that the left has been able to shout down the 2 or 3 most successful, we're left with racism as the only explanation for these huge gaps. And that's what most people are told. You know, when you go to school, you'll see a univariate figure. That's how I describe it, like police stops by race. And the explanation coming from the teacher, and this is true even in many of the HBCUs, it's true even in many of the military academies, the explanation coming from the teacher will be the cops are racist. So Black Lives Matter was able to do this at a very large, very well organized level. They were able to point at dozens of these gaps. They were able to say the only acceptable explanation is racism. And they were able to say, let's fight racism together. And that's why it worked.
But they were also fast and loose with the facts. Like they talk about police killing unarmed black men. And you would think it was an epidemic. What are the real numbers?
Yeah, this is one of the most surprising things that I found, and I always shout her out when I talk about this, that Heather McDonald found starting in about 2015. Washington Post probably read some of this, put together a database.
Right.
But the average number of unarmed black men shot by the police in a typical year is about 12.
Mm-hmm.
Last year it was 16. If you look at unarmed males of all races, this includes like Indian reservations, all the poor whites, Italians, Irishmen, it's under 100. So there are almost none of these cases. And I think that when people, because of how the media normally works, not every murder is on the front page. The famous photogenic murders make the front page. Because of that reality, I think that most people looking at this thought, well, there must be an epidemic of police shootings because there have been 15 of these stories covered this year. Exactly. Michael Brown and Jacob Blake and George Floyd, although it wasn't a shooting, and so on, and so on, and so on. What was actually happening was that as activist groups messaged them, the mainstream national news media was covering every single case like this, which had almost never happened before. And they were covering none of the white cases. I talk about this in Taboo and actually give a numerical breakdown. Right. That if you search high-profile police shooting, on the first 100 pages of Google, you find 3 cases that involve whites. Now, that's the 60% majority of these, right? You find 2 cases that involve Hispanics, and you find 36 cases that involve blacks. There's an entire Wikipedia page called Unarmed Black People Shot by Police. So you're creating the image of this epidemic, this almost street warfare between young brothers and the cops. And of course, no such thing ever existed.
Yeah, near the time of the George Floyd incident, there was a white individual who had almost the same situation.
Oh yeah.
And you heard nothing about it. Knee on the neck, saying, I can't breathe. He died. You don't hear a word
Yeah.
about it because it didn't fit the narrative that was necessary.
Yeah, multiple cases. I think you might be talking about Daniel Shaver, but I think he got shot. There was also Balco, was it? I mean, there were multiple cases within a 2 or 3 year time frame. Dylan Noble, I
Right,
mean, he was a guy who was initially pulled over for driving too fast. He said some harsh words to the cop. He ended up getting shot with a shotgun, I believe, in the head. I
right.
mean, so yes, the way those cases were dealt with is that they simply weren't covered. People like Zach Goldberg have looked at the amount of coverage given to a typical black police shooting case and a typical white police shooting case.
Unbelievably different,
Yeah,
completely different.
order of magnitude. Yes, yeah.
But,
So that's how you create almost a fake scandal.
well, there's so much talk about things have really not gotten any better for blacks in this country. But, I remember as a child going to Tennessee and seeing whites only and colored only signs and being told to pay attention to those. And in the same lifetime, we have black generals and admirals and CEOs of Fortune 500 companies and heads of foundations and university presidents in the same lifetime, which obviously uh, debunks the theory that we have not made any progress. What would you say to those people like Al Sharpton who say we're not making any progress?
Yeah, I mean, so the claim that in empirical terms, blacks and whites have not come to like one another more, that blacks have not advanced in social terms. I mean, the description we would use for it is empirically false in social science. I mean, there are different ways to measure that. Like since the 1950s, approval of interracial dating has gone from 4% among whites, 6% among blacks to 94% among everyone. I mean, two of the last three Democratic candidates for president have been black, although debatably, native born ADOS, that's a different conversation within the black community. But I mean,
Right.
yeah, the claim is ridiculous. The claim is being made for a very specific reason, which is, again, these people believe that racism or oppression is the cause of all group performative gaps. They really, really believe that. So if we're still seeing, or at least they say they do when they compete with us, you can never read another man's mind. But like when you see these gaps in childbearing by marital status or anything, income, arrests, the explanation in the mind of a quote unquote SJW, a quote unquote wokeist, has to be racism. So when someone says racism hasn't decreased since the 1950s, what they're doing is making an operational empirical claim. They're saying the black arrest rate versus the white proxy hasn't changed since the 1960s, which is almost true. And the reason for that has to be racism. Now, the fact that you can externally measure racism and it's declined 90% totally destroys this theory, but that's rarely brought into the same study. That's rarely, we would say, operationalized. An interesting note here also is that as racism is declining, because there's so much talk about racism, race relations are getting worse. So in the 1990s, that kind of Jordan Bird era is how I usually describe it. People just played some football together.
Right.
Race relations, 70% of blacks, 66% of whites said they were good. They're fine. You don't need someone to coddle you all the time. There might be an occasional fist fight, but everyone gets along. We're good.
Exactly.
It's over. The war was 50 years ago. And it almost literally was. I mean, now obviously you had experiences with actual racism in childhood. I have older uncles and so on that have. But I mean, it's important to note that Brown v. Board, which applied primarily in the South. I mean, in Chicago, we were not formally segregated beyond the level of restrictive covenant since the turn of 2 centuries ago. But I mean, that decision took place in 1954.
Right.
The roundup of the last quote unquote werewolves after the defeat of Hitler, that was 1946. So this was quite some time in the past if you're living in Detroit in 1997. So race relations were almost universally rated positive, and then a slow decline began as the media began to cover more stories about racism and as social media developed. You can kind of track this from OJ, but you can really track it from 2006 when Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, so on became more popular. So in a way, it's deeply depressing. We're less racist than ever before, but everyone feels that there are mobs of black teens ready to attack them or white cops ready to shoot them. These almost fantasy scenarios, and it's a problem.
Well, have you had a problem there's so much wokeness in the universities now, and someone who is logical like yourself and conservative, I'm sure must get some pushback.
Well, there's less than I expected, I will say. So Kentucky State is actually not extraordinarily woke. And I think I've said this in a couple of interviews, but I think that might in part be because we are a historically black college.
Hmm.
You know, I've been a member of our executive team. I was the university ombudsman for a while. And our decision making group would be basically black men and women in suits. So it's very hard to pan something off on kind of the white man or something like that. But I also think that beyond like a few bespoke elite schools that don't really have that many students, like Bowdoin, Oberlin, Brown, that are known for protest, most colleges have a sizable cadre of people that are just there to get jobs as cops or lawyers or nurses. And in political science or criminal justice, that's mostly who you're teaching. So I really haven't experienced much backlash golfing locally or something. And I would kind of expect that would be the same if I were a teacher at Georgia Perimeter or Penn State or something like that. I mean, I think a lot of students there would be more focused on the football weekend or on passing the bio exam than on the organic chem exam, than on marching around with signs that say free Iraq or something like that.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. That's been my experience too. I go to a lot of universities, and the students are very enthusiastic. In fact, it's my impression that it's going to be the young people who save our country. They're able to look at things and recognize that the American dream won't be there for them if they continue down this path of silliness.
Yeah.
Let's just put it
No, I think that's correct. Now, one of the things that's interesting is you're actually seeing young people move substantially right, which I mean, I think is good. I'm on the right. But like when you look at young white or black men specifically, I think they've kind of had enough of it, especially the white guys, like these constant lectures about how maybe you're gay or, you know, the toxic masculinity of being alive. You know, these guys are, I mean, you're talking about Trump is polling at more than a quarter of black men and another half say they're not going to vote. You know, the white guys are more to the right than that. Hispanic guys, as much as that. I mean, so to a certain extent, when you hear this kind of content all the time, when very intellectually unimpressive people who are fourth wave feminists or critical race theorists keep telling you stuff that objectively seems to be nonsense. You're an oppressor when you live in a trailer, or there are more than two sexes. You can either go full on Russian and just internalize it, or you can start backlashing. And I think a lot of kids are starting to backlash. Yeah. Like you see a lot more 16-year-olds that look like athletes that are funny to talk to in Trump shirts than you do in shirts that say I'm with her. And a big part of that is that you can't rebel by supporting the same thing that Halliburton does.
Right.
You know, like it used to be, and I don't mean to make fun of this, but it used to be edgy to be gay. Your high school girlfriend might say she was bisexual, whether or not you guys are actually doing anything at all. You know, and it's one of those sort of you're standing out, you're a rebel. If there's a poster on your teacher's door that says it's okay to be bi and love kink, I mean, the same kid is going to look at that just with casual disgust. Like, why is Mr. Anderson promoting this? And I think you then get into kind of almost the dissident right, the old idea of masculinity, people reading books about Rome. I mean, it seems a pretty healthy way to rebel, honestly.
Well, it's refreshing and encouraging to see professors like yourself teaching our students. And I just want to thank you for enlightening all of us during this time. I hope to see you again sometime. Keep up the wonderful work.
Anytime.
Well, thanks to Dr. Wilfred Reilly for coming on the show and talking about his latest book, Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me. He is full of great information and positive information. And I hope that one of the things that people do is inform themselves so that they're not so susceptible to people who distort history and tell lies. Because that's one of the things that Marxists always do. They dumb down the population. They don't want you to know the truth. And they bombard you with lies. best defense against that is reading a lot of different sources. And particularly when you see something that doesn't line up with what you thought before, do some research on that issue so that you become your own source of understanding. It makes a big difference. And thank you all for coming. Make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Listen to all the episodes. Rate us, review us. We love those 5-star evaluations. And spread common sense. We need to make common sense common once again. Remember the pillars of our foundation: faith, liberty, community, and life. See you next week.